By early 1945, disaster was no longer a distant possibility for Nazi Germany. It was no longer even a matter of fronts collapsing somewhere far away. Now the war was closing in on Berlin itself. Inside the Führerbunker, beneath the ruins and government buildings of the capital, Adolf Hitler sat in a world of concrete, stale air, and maps that no longer obeyed him. The year 1944 had brought defeat after defeat. Now, as winter faded into the first gray weeks of spring, those defeats were converging on the heart of the Reich. Spread across the map room table were charts and overlays that told the story with brutal clarity. Red arrows, everywhere red arrows. Each one pointed west. Each one marked another Soviet thrust, another breakthrough, another sector where German forces had failed to hold, failed to delay, failed even to slow what was coming. The bunker had become Hitler's entire world, a subterranean maze of narrow corridors, stale offices, map rooms, and low concrete ceilings where electric lights burned without pause, and the outside world arrived only in fragments, through telephones, dispatches, and officers who came bearing news no one wanted to hear. The ventilation system hummed constantly. It was the sound of mechanical life support for a collapsing regime. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, dampness, and the human smell of too many people living underground for too long. Moisture gathered in beads on the concrete walls. Even with the heating running day and night, the chill of the earth still pressed through. And at the center of it all sat Hitler. His hands were shaking now, not with the faint tremor that aides had quietly noticed months earlier, but with an unmistakable instability that made even holding a document difficult. His face was pale and drawn. His eyes had sunk deeper into their sockets. His posture had folded inward on itself, as if the weight of Germany's destruction had become something physical, something pressing down through his shoulders and spine. He looked far older than 55. His uniform, once perfectly fitted, now hung loosely from a body that had visibly thinned. The voice remained, the gestures remained, the familiar performances of command remained, but the energy that had once dominated rooms seemed to be draining away, leaving behind something brittle, exhausted, and increasingly unreal. General Hans Krebs stood before the map table, pointer in hand. He had replaced Heinz Guderian as chief of the general staff after one argument too many about reality. Now Krebs faced the impossible task his predecessors had faced, explaining military collapse to a man who refused to accept the logic of defeat. The latest reports from the Eastern Front were spread before him. They told the same story as yesterday, and the day before that, and the month before that. The Red Army was attacking everywhere, not in isolated thrusts, not in temporary offensives, but in an unbroken chain of operations that seemed to flow one into another without pause. Since the summer of 1944, Soviet offensives had come in waves so frequent, so heavy, and so coordinated that German commanders had lost the ability to distinguish one catastrophe from the next. Every Soviet success created the conditions for another. Every German retreat opened a new weakness. Every counterattack consumed reserves that could never be replaced. Krebs spoke carefully, tracing the pattern that had emerged across the front. The Soviets would identify a weak sector. They would mass artillery there, not hundreds of guns, but thousands. Then the bombardment would begin. Not fire meant simply to soften defenses, but fire meant to erase them. Bunkers would collapse, trenches would vanish under churned earth, communication lines would be torn apart. German survivors, if they emerged at all, did so stunned, deafened, and disoriented. Then came the tanks, then the infantry, then the operational exploitation. Tank armies driving deep into the rear, roads cut, bridges seized, rail lines severed, divisions isolated, corps headquarters overrun before they could relocate, and by the time German commanders understood the scale of the breakthrough, another offensive would often already be underway somewhere else. That was what made it relentless, not just the power, not just the numbers, but the rhythm. German forces could never recover because the Soviets never allowed them to recover. If reserves were shifted north, the next blow fell south. If artillery was concentrated in one sector, another sector collapsed first. If exhausted units were pulled back to rebuild, they were thrown into another emergency before they could even absorb replacements. The Wehrmacht was no longer fighting a campaign, it was surviving a sequence of crises, and each crisis left it weaker than the last. Hitler interrupted. He wanted specifics. Where exactly were the attacks falling now? What formations were involved? What German units remained in the way? Krebs answered with the grim precision of a man reading an autopsy. In East Prussia, the isolated German garrison was being reduced block by block. There was no escape route, no relief force, no realistic possibility of evacuation. The defenders would die where they stood, and their deaths would buy almost nothing. In Pomerania, Soviet forces were driving toward the Baltic, threatening another encirclement on a scale Germany could no longer survive. In Silesia, Soviet armies were grinding through one of the Reich's last major industrial regions. Coal, steel, transport hubs, production centers, all were being lost one after another. And along the Oder, the most dangerous development of all was taking shape. Soviet bridgeheads had been established on the western bank. German counterattacks had failed to eliminate them. Now the Soviets were reinforcing those bridgeheads, building them out, bringing over heavy equipment, preparing for the final assault on Berlin. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. They did not say it immediately. They did not need to. Berlin was no longer a symbol in the distance. Berlin was becoming a military objective. Hitler listened, and the old pattern returned. Rage first, then disbelief, then accusation. Why, he demanded, could German troops not hold? Why was Soviet numerical superiority always being offered as an excuse? Why were defensive positions collapsing so quickly? Why was German fighting spirit no longer enough? Krebs tried to answer honestly. The Red Army of 1945, he said, was not the Red Army of 1941. It had learned, it had adapted, it had become something Germany no longer had the strength to defeat. Soviet commanders now coordinated infantry, artillery, armor, and air power more effectively than ever before. Their artillery concentrations exceeded anything seen earlier in the war. Their tank armies were not reckless masses anymore, but instruments of exploitation that could turn tactical success into operational collapse in days. Their air force dominated sectors where German movement in daylight had become suicidal. The IL-2s came in waves, the T-34s came in waves, and behind them came more infantry, more guns, more fuel, more ammunition, more men. The Soviet war machine had become relentless because it could afford to be relentless, and because it was no longer fighting for theory or ideology alone. It was fighting for revenge. That part mattered. Krebs knew it. Every officer in the room knew it. And Hitler knew it too, though he would never say it openly. The Red Army was not simply pushing toward Berlin because it was strategically logical. It was pushing because millions of Soviet soldiers had seen what German occupation meant. Burned villages, mass shootings, starved prisoners, entire populations marked for extermination. This was not a war of maneuver alone anymore. It was a war of reckoning. Hitler rejected the analysis almost instantly. The problem, he insisted, was not Soviet strength. It was German weakness of will. His generals were defeatists, his commanders had grown cautious, his army no longer fought with the fanatical commitment required for victory. If every position were held, if every man fought to the last bullet, if no one yielded even a meter of ground, then, he said, the Soviet attacks would break. He began cataloging what he saw as the great lost opportunities of the war. If Moscow had been taken in 1941, if the offensive in 1942 had not stalled, if Stalingrad had been seized quickly, if Kursk had been executed with more determination, if resources had not been wasted elsewhere. Again and again the same argument. Germany had not failed because the war was unwinnable. Germany had failed because others had failed him. Keitel tried to support the narrative. He always did. But even Keitel struggled now. The maps made denial difficult. Soviet breakthroughs were not isolated events. They were the shape of the war itself. Then Wilhelm Burgdorf entered with new reports. More losses. A division destroyed in Hungary. Another failed counterattack in Pomerania. More tanks lost, more positions abandoned, more proof that the German army was not recovering between blows because the blows never stopped. Hitler demanded to see the reserves. Surely there were still formations that could be gathered for a decisive stroke. Surely somewhere there was still enough strength left for one great counteroffensive. The maps revealed the truth. There were no real reserves. Every formation that could still fight was already engaged somewhere. Divisions existed on paper, but not in substance. A division that should have numbered 15,000 men might have 3,000. A panzer regiment might possess only a handful of operational vehicles. A reserve corps might be little more than a title over fragments. The strategic reserve, the thing every army needed to retake the initiative, no longer existed. Hitler shifted to specifics. He seized on reports of isolated local successes, a company that had held, a battalion that had repulsed multiple Soviet assaults, a village that had not yet fallen. This, he insisted, proved what National Socialist will could still achieve. Krebs had to explain carefully that the company in question had been bypassed and destroyed the next day. Local heroism did not change operational reality. That was the problem now. Courage still existed, skill still existed, but neither could reverse the math.
And the math was now merciless. The conversation turned toward Berlin. It had to. If the Oder line failed, what then? What forces existed for the capital? What fortifications were ready? What could actually be done? The answers were terrible. Berlin's defenses were incomplete. Some existed only on planning maps. The forces assigned to defend the city included Volkssturm militia, wounded convalescents, administrative troops, scattered remnants of shattered divisions, boys too young for war, and old men far too old for it. The regular army units available were skeletal. Artillery was scarce. Fuel was scarce. Training was minimal. The city was full of civilians who would need food, water, medical care, and shelter under bombardment and siege. And against this improvised defense, the Soviets would bring entire armies, thousands of guns, thousands of tanks, a city defense in theory, and annihilation in practice. Yet Hitler insisted Berlin would hold. Every district would become a fortress, every building a strong point, every street a killing ground. He spoke of Berlin as a new Stalingrad, but in reverse. The comparison made no military sense. Stalingrad had been sustained by a river lifeline. Berlin would have none. Stalingrad had been defended against an enemy still learning offensive warfare. Berlin would be attacked by the Red Army at the peak of its operational skill. But to Hitler, the myth mattered more than the reality. He wanted symbols. He wanted endurance. He wanted martyrdom if victory was no longer possible. Then, almost as an aside, he asked whether chemical weapons might break up Soviet assault formations. The silence in the room was immediate. Everyone understood what that meant. Germany still had chemical weapons. So did the Soviets and the Western Allies. Any German use of them now would invite retaliation on a scale the Reich could no longer survive. The idea was allowed to die in silence. Hitler shifted again. Why, he demanded, would the Western Allies not see the Soviet danger and make peace with Germany? Surely Churchill and Roosevelt understood that Bolshevism was the greater long-term threat. Surely they must see that Germany was Europe's only barrier against Soviet domination. Keitel muttered something about tentative contacts having failed. The Allied demand for unconditional surrender remained firm. To Hitler, this was incomprehensible. He could not understand why the Western powers would continue cooperating with Stalin. But that confusion reflected a larger truth. Hitler had never truly understood how others thought unless they thought like him. The conference dragged on, sector by sector, disaster by disaster. Soviets in Courland, Soviets in Austria, Soviets nearing Dresden, Soviets expanding along the Oder. The same pattern everywhere. Attack, breakthrough, encirclement, collapse. Again and again, Hitler issued orders that had already drifted into fantasy. Units that no longer existed were ordered to counterattack. Divisions that had been destroyed were reassigned to hold sectors. Positions were to be held at all costs, even when they had already been outflanked. The orders went out. Commanders acknowledged them, then ignored what they had to ignore in order to prevent immediate disaster. By evening, Krebs summarized the day. The Red Army's relentless pressure was not simply winning battles, it was consuming the Wehrmacht's remaining ability to resist. The fall of Berlin was now a matter of time, not possibility. Germany faced not just defeat, but destruction. Hitler listened. When he answered, he still spoke of miracle weapons, of political breaks, of final resistance. But his voice no longer carried conviction. The words were still familiar, the belief behind them was fading. Eventually, he dismissed the staff. They left him alone with the maps. He stood there staring at the red arrows that now defined his world. The attacks would continue because the Soviet Union could sustain them, because the Red Army had the manpower, the guns, the fuel, the tanks, the aircraft, and the hatred to keep pressing forward without pause. Germany did not. Hitler had built his career on the promise of German rebirth, on revenge for Versailles, on national greatness, on a Reich that would last 1,000 years. Now the war he had unleashed was ending with Berlin itself under threat, Germany facing occupation, partition, and ruin. And there would be no pause, no breathing space, no armistice bought through maneuver, no recovery. Because the Red Army was not simply attacking, it was exacting payment. Every atrocity committed in the East had returned now in military form. Every burned village, every dead prisoner, every murdered civilian, they had all become fuel for the Soviet advance. That was why the attacks felt so relentless, because they were no longer only strategic, they were moral. Germany had unleashed a war of annihilation. Now that war was coming home. As night settled over Berlin and the bunker lights kept burning, fresh reports continued to arrive. More attacks, more pressure, more sectors giving way. The maps on the table made the truth impossible to escape. Red arrows from the Baltic to the Adriatic, German positions isolated, outnumbered, or already doomed. Even if Hitler refused to accept it in words, the war had already spoken. He stood there with trembling hands resting on the edge of the map table, looking down at the visual record of his failure. He had promised greatness, he had delivered annihilation, and the Red Army would not stop. Not because it lacked mercy, but because it no longer wanted mercy. The Soviet advance would continue until Berlin fell, until Germany surrendered,
until the regime that had brought catastrophe to the Soviet Union had itself been ground into ruin. That was the meaning of the relentless attacks, not just military pressure, judgment. And now, deep underground, surrounded by stale air, concrete walls, and maps painted red with disaster, Hitler was finally facing the one thing he could neither overpower, nor outshout, nor outbelieve, an enemy that had both the means and the will to destroy him completely.